My parents never visited after my accident. Then I learned the truth. I don't remember the exact moment of impact, but I do remember the seconds right before. The squeal of tires, the blur of headlights in the wrong place, the way my hands clenched the steering wheel in some useless reflex of control. Then nothing. Just a void, a blank space where time should have been. When I woke up, the world was smaller, and I was trapped inside my own body. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and something else. Something I could never quite name but would always associate with those weeks in recovery. My body ached, my ribs felt like they had been pried apart, and my legs weren't listening to me anymore. That was the first thing I noticed when the fog in my head cleared enough to let me recognize my new reality. I tried to move my right foot, and nothing happened. Left foot? Still nothing. A numbness like stone replaced what should have been my flesh and bone. Doctors came in and out, telling me things that didn't seem real. Spinal cord injury. Paraplegia. Permanent. Words stacked up like bricks between the life I had before and the life I was going to have now. Friends visited, their eyes full of pity. Colleagues sent flowers and well wishes. Even my landlord, a gruff man named Wendell who never spoke much, came by with a bag of groceries I couldn't even use in the hospital. But my parents never came. At first, I told myself they didn't know. Maybe the hospital hadn't reached them. Maybe their phones were off. But I knew better. I had given the nurse my mother's number myself. I had watched her dial it, watched her leave a message in that soft, professional voice, explaining that her son had been in an accident, that he was alive but in serious condition, that they should come as soon as possible. No one came. Days turned into weeks. I stopped pretending that I wasn't waiting for them. I was waiting for them. Every morning, I told myself today would be the day they walked through that door. That my mother would rush in, hands fluttering, voice trembling with concern. That my father would stand stiffly beside her, awkward and silent but present. And every night, I lay awake in a hospital bed under the dim glow of a hallway light, staring at the door that never opened for them. I called. Again and again I called. My mother's voicemail was the same every time, her voice calm, as if her only son wasn't lying in a hospital bed, broken and abandoned. My father had never been one for phones, but I left messages on their landline too. I kept them brief at first, just asking them to call me back. Then I started telling them the truth. I told them I was paralyzed. I told them I needed them. And when nothing came of it, when no reply ever came, I started asking why. Why weren't they coming? Why weren't they calling? I had grown up in a house where silence was used as punishment. My father would retreat into himself when he was angry, withholding words like they were currency. My mother filled the void with nervous chatter, pretending the silence wasn't there. I used to be the one who would break first, blurting out apologies for things I wasn't even sure I had done just to get them to talk again. I recognized this silence. It was a weapon. When the hospital discharged me, it was to an empty apartment that wasn't built for the life I now had. I struggled with everything. The kitchen counters were too high, the bathroom too narrow. My bed, which once felt comfortable, now felt like a fortress I had to scale just to find rest. The loneliness was the worst part. Before the accident, I had a life. A job in logistics that I didn't love but didn't hate. A handful of friends I met for drinks on Fridays. A gym routine that kept my mind and body occupied. Now all of it was gone. The company had been sympathetic but clear. My position required mobility. The lease on my apartment was month to month, and Wendell gently hinted that I might need something more suitable soon. My friends visited less and less. I kept calling my parents. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted them to feel guilty. Maybe I thought deep down they would break and finally show up. But my mother never answered. My father never called back. The only confirmation I had that they were still out there was the one time I called from a different number and my mother picked up. Hello. It was such a small thing, hearing her voice, but it shook me. I said her name, and the silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. And then, just as quickly, the call ended. She had hung up. That was the answer, wasn't it? That was all the answer I was ever going to get. I spent the next few days in a haze, the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself with sobbing but instead seeps into everything, turning life into something gray and heavy. I couldn't understand it. I wasn't a bad son. I had never been arrested, never gotten into trouble. I had done everything they asked of me. Gone to college, gotten a job, stayed out of their way. But when I needed them, they had turned away like I was nothing. It was during one of those long, empty days that I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. Looking through old photos. My hands, still clumsy with the wheelchair, knocked over a box in my closet, and the pictures spilled out like ghosts. A birthday party from when I was 10. My mother smiling beside me as I blew out the candles. A Christmas morning with my father, stiff and formal, holding a gift I had given him. A family vacation where I stood between them, unaware of the distance that would one day become a canyon. Had I ever really known them? Or had I just spent my life hoping they would become the parents I needed them to be? I stared at the pictures for a long time before picking up my phone again. I dialed my mother's number one last time, listening to the rings echo into nothingness, waiting for a voice that would never come. When the beep sounded, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. "I get it now," I said. "I really do. I should have stopped calling after that last message. I should have let the silence stand. But something in me wouldn't let it go. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe it was just the habit of a lifetime, chasing something that was never really there. Either way, I wasn't finished yet. I thought about driving to their house, but that was the thing, I couldn't drive anymore. My car was still sitting in the impound lot, a twisted wreck of steel and shattered glass. Even if it had been drivable, I wasn't. Not in the way I used to be. The world didn't work the same anymore. Sidewalks became battlefields. Stairs turned into locked doors, and distances stretched farther than they ever had before. My body was a cage and the key was long gone. So I did the only thing left. I paid someone to take me. His name was Jonah. Some guy from a rideshare app with a van outfitted for wheelchair access. When he pulled up outside my building, he barely looked at me. I was used to that by now. People didn't like to see what had happened to me. They either stared too long or didn't look at all. Jonah was the second kind, which I preferred. "Where to?" he asked. I gave him the address. My childhood home. The place where everything started and apparently where it had all ended. He punched it into the GPS and didn't ask any questions. The ride was quiet. Just the sound of tires on asphalt, the occasional chirp from his phone giving him directions he probably already knew. I watched the city blur past, then the suburbs, then the long, winding roads that led to the house I hadn't seen in years. When we got there, I almost told him to turn around. Almost. But I had come this far. I had to see it through. The house looked exactly the same. White siding, blue shutters, a front porch with the same wooden swing my mother used to sit on in the evenings. The grass was a little overgrown, the flower beds empty, but it was still the house I remembered. I stared at the front door, half expecting it to open. Didn't. Jonah glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "You want me to wait?" I should have said no. I should have told him to leave. But I shook my head. "Give me a minute." I rolled myself up the driveway, the uneven pavement making every inch feel like a battle. The ramp hadn't changed. My father had built it years ago when my grandmother had lived with us before she passed. I wondered if he thought about that when he decided to pretend I didn't exist. I knocked. Then I knocked again. I heard movement inside, footsteps, the scrape of a chair against tile. They were home. They were there. They just weren't answering. My stomach twisted. I knocked harder, my knuckles aching against the wood. "Mom? Dad? It's me." Nothing. I clenched my teeth. I could hear the television. I could hear them breathing in there, pretending I wasn't standing on their doorstep. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part of me wanted to break the door down. But I couldn't do either. I wasn't a kid throwing a tantrum. I was a man who had been left behind. I backed away, slowly. My hands trembled on the wheels of my chair. Jonah was still waiting by the van, watching me carefully. I could feel the pity radiating off him, even if he didn't say a word. "Let's go," I muttered, and he nodded, opening the door for me. As we pulled away, I kept my eyes on the house. I told myself I wasn't hoping to see the door open. But I was. I really was. It never did. The ride back to my apartment was silent. Jonah didn't ask questions and I didn't offer answers. I just stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. My hands rested on my lap, fingers curled into fists, nails pressing into my palms. My parents had been inside. They had heard me, and still they hadn't opened the door. Back in my apartment, I sat there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by unopened mail and half-empty water bottles. The loneliness pressed against me heavier than before. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the way things would always be. Then, 3 days later, my phone rang. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The number on the screen wasn't saved in my contacts, but I knew it. My mother's number. My breath caught in my throat as I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before I answered. "Hello." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment I thought she had hung up. Then I heard it, the soft sound of her breathing. The same hesitation I had heard my whole life whenever she was afraid to say what she really felt. We didn't know what to say," she finally admitted, her voice small, unsure. I swallowed hard. "So you said nothing?" She didn't answer right away. "Your father thought, we thought you wouldn't want to see us. That you'd blame us somehow." Blame them? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. For what? For not being the parents you needed us to be. For making you feel like you couldn't come to us. And when you did, we didn't answer. I don't know why, Jonah. I wish I had an excuse. We were ashamed. Afraid. And then it just got easier to pretend you weren't calling than to face what we had done. The lump in my throat was unbearable now. I clenched my jaw, willing myself not to let the emotion take over. And now I can't stop thinking about you standing on our doorstep, about how we let you leave like that. I've never been more ashamed in my life. There was a rustling sound, then another voice. My father's, rougher, quieter. Jonah, I know you don't have any reason to believe this, but I never stopped thinking about you. I didn't know how to be a father to you after this happened. I barely knew how to be a father to you before, and that's my fault. All of it. I closed my eyes. The anger I had held onto for so long, anger that had kept me upright, kept me moving, kept me from collapsing under the weight of abandonment, began to crack. I don't know how to fix this, I admitted. My mother's breath hitched. Maybe we can figure it out together, if you'll let us. I didn't answer right away. I let the weight of the moment settle. Then finally I exhaled. Okay. It wasn't an easy road after that. My parents didn't magically become perfect overnight, and neither did I. There were awkward moments, conversations that felt like stepping over broken glass. But little by little, things began to shift. They started visiting. At first, it was just short visits, bringing me groceries, helping me rearrange furniture to make my space more accessible. My father, the man who had spent most of his life avoiding emotion, sat with me one afternoon and admitted that he had always been terrified of showing weakness, that seeing me in the wheelchair had made him face things about himself he wasn't ready to face. My mother cried more than once. She apologized more times than I could count. But more importantly, she showed up. They both did. And I started to realize that while they had failed me before, they were trying now. Trying to be the parents they never were. Trying to make up for the silence that had nearly broken us all. One evening, months later, my father asked if I wanted to take a drive. I got the van modified, he said gruffly. Figured it was time. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an earth-shattering moment. But it was something. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone anymore.